Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're digging into something really fascinating, a historical journey sparked by, well, none other than the great soul singer Arnold Blair.
Ah, yes. He has a way of posing these incredibly profound questions, doesn't he? Starting us off on another thought experiment.
He really does. He's inviting us to think deeply about power, resistance, the whole nature of empire, really. And it started with this specific thought he shared, a real what-if scenario that gets you thinking, he asked. In history, the country of India did not give in to British rule, and the whole country and its people were destroyed. China saw this and raised war against all of Western nations, defeating them and placing them in bondage. The Chinese did so for fear that they too would be destroyed as India was. What do you think?
Hmm, that's powerful. It's not just history, it's philosophical, like you said. It forces us to grapple with why things happened the way they did.
Exactly. Why did these two immense ancient civilizations have such different outcomes when faced with Western expansion? It makes you question everything you thought you knew about resistance and power.
It does. And Arnold Blair's framing is just perfect for what we want to explore today. Using our sources, particularly Rashad's insights from The Empire Wears Many Faces, we're going to try and unpack this.
So why India fell, essentially, it became fully colonized.
While China, despite, immense pressure and exploitation, managed to hold on to its core sovereignty, even if battered and scarred.
And it's not simple, is it? Rashad really emphasizes that.
Not at all. History rarely is. Conquest, empire building, it's messy, multi-layered. It's often driven by these deeper patterns, things less obvious than just, say, military strength.
Less about just battles, more about the anatomy of empire itself, as Rashad puts it.
Precisely. So let's try and dissect that anatomy a bit.
Okay, so setting the table. Rashad, in The Empire Wears Many Faces, pushes back against this idea that colonial history was inevitable. He talks about deeper patterns. What does that mean in practice?
Well, it's about challenging that simplistic narrative, isn't it? The idea that it had to happen this way because, well, Britain was stronger or India was weaker.
Right, it sort of removes agency and complexity.
Exactly. Rajad argues that framing it as inevitable misses the crucial details, how empires actually operate, how they project power, and maybe just as importantly, how resistance, even if it ultimately fails in the short term, shapes the story, shapes the future.
So looking beyond the obvious strength versus weakness thing.
Yes. Rashad tells us to look for the unseen forces. Things like geography, always a huge factor. The existing political landscape, was the target nation unified or divided?
Like the internal divisions within India, maybe?
Precisely. And economic motivations, absolutely key. Often disguised, as Rashad says, as something noble greed masked as civilization. It's a chilling phrase, but often quite accurate.
Yeah.
And then you have the forms of resistance, military, diplomatic, cultural. How did people push back, and how did that influence the outcome, even if it didn't stop the colonization entirely?
So the core question, really stemming from Arnold Blair's prompt, is why India was fully colonized, swallowed whole maybe, while China wasn't.
That's the heart of it. It requires us to look beyond just military tech or willpower and examine the whole system.
Okay, let's start with India then. Following Arnold Blair's thought, why did Britain succeed there? Our sources suggest it wasn't just one thing, right? More like a systematic breakdown.
Absolutely systematic. It wasn't a blitzkrieg. It was a slow, methodical, multi-pronged attack on Indian sovereignty, exploiting weaknesses with, frankly, ruthless efficiency.
And the first weakness was political?
Very much so. The first major factor was the fractured political landscape after the Mughal Empire's decline. By the 1700s, the Mughals, who had once controlled vast swaths of the subcontinent, were losing their grip.
So it wasn't one unified India facing the British.
Not at all. It was a subcontinent of competing, fragmented kingdoms and states. You had powerful players like the Marathas, Mysore underrulers like Tipu Sultan, places like Awadh, Bengal, incredibly wealthy Hyderabad, the Sikh confederacies up north, all jostling for power.
The perfect situation for divide and conquer.
Textbook. The British East India Company became masters at exploiting these internal rivalries. They'd form alliances with one ruler against another, offer bribes, sometimes just outright betray allies, whatever it took to gain an advantage.
So they didn't just march in, they played the existing political game.
They played it brilliantly and ruthlessly. And certain battles were key turning points in this strategy. The Battle of Plassey in 1757, for example.
That's the famous one with Robert Clive.
It is. Though it was less a glorious victory and more about Clive bribing a key general, the Nawab of Bengal. But the result was the same. It gave the company crucial control over Bengal, which was like the economic engine of India at the time.
And then Buxar.
Yes, the Battle of Buxar in 1764 is perhaps even more significant militarily. It cemented British dominance in the region after they defeated a combined force. Our sources call this the start of their cancer-like expansion inland. It's like a grim image, but it captures that slow, invasive spread.
Wow. Okay, so political division was key. But you mentioned the economic engine. Rashad really stresses the economic side, this idea that India basically paid for its own conquest. How did that work?
This is just staggering when you dig into it, and it gets right back to Arnold Blair's curiosity about how India's strength was turned against it. It's about economic leverage through taxation and trade. The real game changer wasn't just Plassey or Buxar, but the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765.
What did that treaty do?
It granted the East India Company the Diwani rights, the right to collect land taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. These were incredibly rich provinces.
So a private company collecting taxes for entire provinces.
Exactly. Think about that. Suddenly the company had this enormous, self-sustaining revenue stream flowing directly into its coffers. It didn't need to rely on London for funds anymore.
And that's the money they used
To raise their armies.
Mm.
Armies composed mostly of Indian soldiers, the sepoys, but led by British officers. So, quite literally, India paid for its own colonization. Indian tax revenue funded the military force that conquered other Indian states.
Mm-hmm.
It's diabolical, financially speaking.
That's unbelievable, turning the conquered land's wealth into the tool of its own further conquest.
Precisely. And it didn't stop there. The British also systematically dismantled India's own industries through their trade policies. This is the deindustrialization part.
India was famous for textiles, wasn't it?
World famous.
Yeah.
Finest cottons, silks. But British policy actively destroyed that. They slapped heavy tariffs on finished Indian textiles coming into Britain, while Indian raw cotton went out cheap. Then British factories using that cotton churned out machine-made cloth that flooded the Indian market, often tax-free or with minimal duties.
Undercutting local weavers completely.
Devastatingly so. Entire artisan economies collapsed. India went from being a global manufacturing hub to basically a supplier of raw materials and a captive market for British goods. Economic violence on a massive scale.
So political division, economic exploitation. What about the military aspect? Was it just superior weapons?
That's the common assumption, but Rashad argues it's more nuanced. Yes,
Yeah.
technology mattered, but the bigger advantage was superior military organization.
How so?
The company's troops, Europeans and sepoys alike, were drilled year-round. Strict discipline, clear hierarchy, professional standing army. They mastered combined arms tactics, infantry, cavalry, artillery, working together seamlessly. And crucially, they had naval support for logistics and deployment.
Compared to the Indian armies.
Indian armies often relied on feudal levies, soldiers loyal to local lords, maybe serving seasonally. They could be incredibly brave, numerically superior sometimes, but often lacked that consistent training, unified command structure, and logistical support. They were less cohesive, especially in long campaigns.
So organization and discipline were as important, maybe more so than just the guns themselves.
Very much so.
Yeah.
It allowed for sustained campaigns, better coordination, resilience after setbacks. It was a clash of military systems, not just weapons.
Okay, this next one you mentioned, legal warfare, sounds particularly insidious. Conquest through treaties. Paper replacing resistance.
It really is chilling when you think about it. This is conquest through treaties or legal warfare. Not all territory was taken by force. A huge amount of expansion happened through manipulating laws and treaties. As Rashad puts it, law replaced violence.
How did they manage that?
A prime example is Lord Wellesley's subsidiary alliance system around 1798 to 1805. Basically, the British offered Indian states protection.
Sounds helpful, but I sense a catch.
A massive catch. To get this protection, the state had to accept a permanent British military garrison
Okay.
and pay for that garrison's upkeep. They also had to give up control of their foreign policy, couldn't negotiate with other states without British approval.
So they became completely dependent, protectorates in name, but controlled in practice.
Exactly. They lost their independence piece by piece, all signed away in a treaty, no war needed. It was a brilliant trapping mechanism.
And the doctrine of lapse.
Another legal tool, used aggressively by Lord Dalhousie between 1848 and 1856. This policy stated that if an Indian ruler died without a natural heir, or if the British simply deemed the state misgoverned, Britain could annex it.
A convenient pretext.
Extremely convenient. It allowed them to swallow up states like Jhansi, Nagpur, Satara without firing a shot. just bureaucratic annexation, expanding the empire with a pen, not a sword.
And all this wasn't happening in a vacuum, right? There's the bigger picture of Britain's global power.
Absolute vital context.
Yeah.
Factor 5 is the global context and British power projection. India's colonization was part of Britain's rise to global dominance.
After wars like the Seven Years' War.
Yes, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, crippled their main rival, France, globally. Then, victory in the Napoleonic Wars cemented British naval supremacy. Add the power of the Industrial Revolution fueling their economy and need for resources and markets. Britain had unparalleled momentum.
So they had the resources and the reach that others didn't.
Precisely. Other European powers had footholds in Asia, the French, Dutch, Portuguese, but only Britain had the sustained capacity for a continental conquest like India. They had the backing of London's banks, the Royal Navy controlling the seas, vast global trade networks. The whole machinery for projecting and sustaining power over immense distances.
They could manage the logistics, the finances, the administration on a scale others couldn't match.
Exactly. It allowed them to systematically take over a place as vast and complex as India. It was a unique combination of factors converging at that moment in history.
Okay, so that paints a clear, if grim, picture for India. Fragmented politics, economic strangulation, superior military organization, legal manipulation, all backed by global dominance. Which brings us back to Arnold Blair's core question. Why didn't this happen to China? They face similar pressures, right?
Intense pressure, yes.
Yeah.
Opium wars, unequal treaties, spheres of influence. China suffered immensely. But it wasn't fully colonized, politically absorbed in the way India was. And there's several key reasons for this resilience.
What's the first major difference?
The first is China's vast, centralized state machinery. Unlike India's post-Mughal fragmentation, the Qing Empire, despite its own massive internal problems like the Taiping Rebellion, remained a largely unified entity.
A single government structure across that huge area.
Yes, governing over 400 million people through this established Confucian bureaucracy. It reached everywhere. Rashad highlights the one government, one tax system, one civil service. This deep-rooted unity meant Europeans couldn't easily slice it up from within, playing factions against each other quite as effectively as they did in India.
They could chip away at the edges, but the core held.
The core administrative structure held, yes. It was wounded, strained, often corrupt, but it didn't shatter in the same way.
And you mentioned the East India Company's unique role in India. Did China have anything like that?
Critically, no. That's the second major factor. No East India Company equivalent. No private foreign corporation ever gained military power or, crucially, the right to collect taxes within China.
So no internal financial engine for conquest funded by the Chinese themselves.
Exactly. Foreign merchants were restricted first to Canton, then later to specific treaty ports after the Opium Wars. Their activities were controlled. Foreign powers extracted wealth through trade, often unfair trade, but they never got their hands on the internal levers of state power, like taxation or raising local armies the way the EIC did in India.
That seems like a fundamental difference in how the interaction was structured.
Absolutely fundamental. It prevented that insidious internal colonization process.
Okay, what else protected China? Its size.
Size was definitely a factor. Point 3. China was simply too big to swallow, and maybe too valuable to break completely. Imperialists definitely dreamt of carving up China maps were drawn.
Spheres of influence and all that.
Right. But the sheer scale, the population, the geography, a full military conquest and administration would have been astronomically expensive and difficult. Plus, the imperial powers deeply distrusted each other.
They couldn't agree on how to divide the spoils.
Pretty much. Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Japan, the U.S. None wanted another to gain too much power from China's collapse. So after the Opium Wars, 1839-42, 1856-60, the focus shifted. China lost territory, tariff control, faced humiliation, but no single power could take it all.
Which led to the open door policy.
Yes, the U.S. Open Door Note of 1899 basically formalized this idea.
Yeah.
Let's all have equal commercial access, let's exploit China economically, but let's not try to formally partition and rule it politically. It was a kind of imperial stalemate, focused on economic penetration over direct rule.
So they made concessions, these unequal treaties, but maybe strategically, to avoid something worse.
That's a really interesting interpretation, and it ties into the fourth point. Tactical concessions leading to survival without collapse. The Qing dynasty did sign these humiliating treaties, giving up tariff control, ports, extraterritorial rights for foreigners,
Yeah.
deeply damaging to sovereignty.
But it kept the state intact.
Technically, yes. While incredibly humiliating, these concessions arguably prevented a complete political collapse or fragmentation like India experienced. It kept the Qing dynasty, however weakened, in power and preserved China as a single, albeit violated, entity. It bought time.
Time for what?
Time for eventual resurgence.
Hmm.
Under the Republic, later under Mao. It was a strategy, perhaps, of survival over potentially suicidal, all-out resistance that might have shattered the country completely, bending rather than breaking, even if it meant deep bows.
Did they try to strengthen themselves internally during this time?
They did. That's the fifth point.
Yeah.
Strategic modernization attempts, like the self-strengthening movement. After the shocks of the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion from about 1860 onwards, some Qing elites like Li Hongzhang and Zheng Guofan realized they needed to adapt.
Adopt Western technologies.
Selectively, yes.
Yeah.
Build arsenals, railways, shipyards, train modern armies. The idea was to use Western means to defend against Western ends.
Was it successful?
Not entirely. They still suffered defeats, like against Japan in 1894 and 95. But these efforts were crucial in preventing deeper colonization. It showed some capacity for reform and resistance, helped them suppress internal threats like the Taipings, and arguably prevented a total breakdown of central authority. It was an important, though flawed, defensive modernization.
And finally, you mentioned geography earlier for India. How did it play out for China?
Geography is the sixth factor, and it definitely favored China's defense. Unlike India's long, accessible coastline, China's vast geography, mountains, deserts, sheer distance made invasion and control incredibly difficult.
Just the logistics would be a nightmare for an occupying force.
Exactly. Plus, the Qing state maintained control over crucial internal infrastructure, especially the Grand Canal and the Yangtze River. This allowed them to move troops and grain efficiently within the empire, maintaining internal cohesion in a way foreign powers, mostly stuck in coastal areas, couldn't easily disrupt.
So that internal logistical control was a key advantage.
A massive advantage in holding such a vast territory together against external pressure.
Okay, so putting it all together, reflecting back on Arnold Blair's question and Rashad's analysis, two very different paths, weren't they?
Two distinct paths through the same storm of imperialism. Rashad's reflective closing really synthesizes this well. India, tragically, fell due to that perfect storm. Internal fragmentation, relentless economic penetration, legal manipulation, British global power.
While China survived through its centralized state, cautious concessions, sheer scale, and geography.
Right. But, and this is so important, Rashad emphasizes neither escaped harm. India became a formal colony. China became a semi-colony sovereign on paper, but, as he puts it, economically and militarily violated.
So survival, but at a tremendous cost. Not fully devoured, but deeply wounded.
Precisely. No easy victories, no clean escapes. And this leads to that profound lesson from Rashad: the core of the empire wears many faces. Conquest rarely begins with war.
It starts before the battles.
Often, yes, it starts subtly, with debt, with playing on internal divisions, with unequal treaties, with exploitative trade. It's a slow weakening, an erosion, until effective resistance just isn't possible anymore. That's the quiet, insidious nature of how empire often works.
Which brings us to Arnold Blair's final observation, that really powerful image. Now there is a sea of red covering the world made by the red flag of China. What to make of this? Rashad connects this directly back to that history, doesn't he? Like pieces on a go board.
He does. Beautifully and poetically. Rashad suggests China's current global presence isn't some sudden grab for power in the old imperial style. It's the long arc, he says, of a nation that never forgot being cracked open by foreign powers.
So strategy born from historical trauma, from that memory of humiliation.
Exactly. It's deeply ingrained. And the fascinating part is how China rose. Not by conquering the West militarily, but by mastering the very tools that once humiliated it.
Trade, debt, diplomacy.
Yes. It flipped the script. It watched, learned, and adapted. Instead of gunboats, Rashad points to infrastructure deals. Instead of soldiers demanding concessions, think currency reserves and economic leverage. Instead of colonial forts, maybe today it's surveillance networks or digital influence.
Different tools, but aimed at projecting influence and securing interests.
It's a modern echo. As Arnold Blair saw, the red flag stretches far, but Rashad argues it's largely through strategy born of survival, not traditional conquest. His metaphor is stunning. Where others drowned, China learned to breathe underwater.
Wow. Mastering the very environment that threatened to destroy it.
Highlighting that incredible strategic adaptation, that mastery of global economic and diplomatic tools. Which brings us back to that enduring maxim: empire wears many faces, and history never forgets. The forms change, but the dynamics of power and influence persist.
It's been quite a journey. Starting with Arnold Blair's powerful What If, and tracing these complex histories through Rashad's lens, we've seen how internal factors, external pressures, strategic choices, how they all weave together to shape the destinies of nations like India and China, different outcomes, but shared scars from that imperial encounter.
And the crucial takeaway for you, listening, is that this isn't just dusty history. It's a vital framework for understanding today. If empire truly wears many faces and history's memory is long, what new forms of influence or control might be emerging now? How are the lessons of India and China, the strategies of resistance and survival, playing out in current global affairs?
Thinking about the tools Rashad identified: debt, trade, technology, information.
Exactly. How are those tools being used today? Understanding these historical patterns, the subtle ways power operates beyond just military might, can help you critically analyze the empires and dynamics shaping our own world. It's a history that's still being written.